Welcome to our next conference in formation for the Rule of St. Benedict for the North American Preceptory of the Militia Templi. Today our conference is Nothing Harsh and Nothing Burdensome. We are going to establish a school of God's service in which we hope to establish nothing harsh, nothing burdensome, taken from the Prologue to the Rule of St. Benedict. St. Benedict's Rule was not the first monastic rule. We know that hundreds of years before St. Benedict's time, there were many monks, including the great St. Anthony of the Desert, and then there were also other monastic rules, such as the monastic rule of St. Basil. So what do we mean when he said, nothing harsh, nothing burdensome? When we look at the heroic feats of groups like the Desert Fathers, who St. Athanasius recorded down, or the writings of the Institutes and the Conferences, which a somewhat contemporary St. John Cassian wrote down, we examine in the lives of the early monks tremendous ardor and tremendous feats of both penance and fasting. In fact, Cassian laments at his time that monks would even dare lay on a mattress of straw. And when we look at the life of St. Benedict, we're going to notice that he takes monasticism in a somewhat different direction and puts a different emphasis on perfection than that extremely difficult bodily living. But with that being said, we know that Saint Benedict himself actually did live out a life of tremendous harshness, especially early on when he left his home. He did exactly what was considered the monastic ideal at the time. He retired to an isolated spot in the wilderness, dwelt in a cave, endured hunger, and was exposed to the harshness of the weather, and had most of the time only the assistance of Saint Romanus, who was like his spiritual father, so to speak, who gave him his first rule, clothed him in the habit of a monk, and brought him bread. So we know that when Saint Benedict wrote down his rule, he knew how to live a harsh life. But so what he was proposing for other monks to live out was a very specific form of living that would be emphasized on communal life that eventually would wind up spreading throughout all of Western Europe, and was a form of monastic life that it seemed that the people who would come and become Christians, we were very disposed to being able to do. Dom Mourn declares that in these matters, St. Benedict's regime was no more than what was often imposed on Christians living in the world. So, for example, St. Benedict having his monks eat twice a day, that was the common practice in Italy at that time he wrote down the rule. Or the clothing that the various monks were allowed to wear, the pair of work boots and the second pair of shoes, and even coverings for them, the straw mattress, the amount of sleep he allowed. All those things were very similar to what a normal Christian living out the Christian life would have been expected at the time. But this shouldn't shock us or surprise us, because as Cardinal Gasset says in a sketch of monastic history, the monastic life is nothing more than the Christian life of the Gospel counsels, conceived in its full simplicity and perfection. It has no determinate object in view beyond this. It has no special systems or methods. The broad law of Christian liberty is its only guide. It is neither strict nor lax. It aims neither at too high things, nor is it content with any low standard of conduct. Why are we going over this topic as poor Knights of Christ? Why, especially when you consider the courage of the Knights Templar, who are, where we find our patrimony, why emphasize nothing burdensome, nothing harsh? Because what is contained in our rule of life, which is taken from, largely inspired by the rule of St. Benedict, shares that in common. Nothing burdensome, nothing harsh. What is proposed is a specific way of living out those gospel counsels in a very real way. Take, for example, In 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, verse 11, St. Paul tells all Christians, pray without ceasing. He doesn't say to monks, pray without ceasing. He doesn't say to heroic elders, pray without ceasing. He doesn't just say to bishops, pray without ceasing. He says to all Christians to pray without ceasing. And so much so that is how we do it. We do it by offering the daily hours of the divine office to bring our minds back to God, so in those times where we are not engaged in formal prayer, our hearts and minds are continually going back to God. And if somebody does not say the divine office, they are not under the they may not be under the obligation to pray without ceasing that way, but they as a Christian are still very much under the obligation to pray without ceasing. Or take, for example, the requirement of a knight to have an apostolate within the order or outside the order in some way, something to help the church. Well, this can be taken from the Gospels. This could be taken from tradition. This could be taken from common sense, that if we are to love God with our whole heart, mind, and soul, that we should constantly look for ways to serve Him. But it can also be taken from canon law. Canon 210, the current Code of Canon Law, says, all the Christian faithful must direct their efforts to lead a holy life and to promote the growth of the Church and its continual sanctification according to their own condition. And Canon 211, all the Christian faithful have the duty and right to work so that the divine message of salvation more and more reaches all people in every age and in every land. So if one does not do this in our brotherhood, they are still, as a baptized Christian, as a faithful Roman Catholic, still called to have an apostolate. And our rule is complete. Whether it deals with how frequently we should attend confession, what prayers we say, how we should mortify the flesh, or whatever, our rule and the rule of St. Benedict, if faithfully followed, will bring us to Christian perfection. So whenever we fall short, whenever we don't live up to the rule, we shouldn't look at it as some ideal that we cannot reach, but rather we should go, I was unable to live up to the simplicity of the Gospels proposed in the rule, because there was nothing burdensome and nothing harsh there, and I should repent and amend my life. And as the Imitation of Christ says about such things, if a holy exercise be sometimes omitted for the sake of some act of piety or of some brotherly kindness, it can easily be taken up afterwards. But if it be neglected through distaste or slothfulness, then it is sinful, and the mischief will be felt. Strive as earnestly as we may, we shall still fall short in many things. So on that note, my brothers, bear in mind that our rule of life is a light burden on us, that if we faithfully follow, we will be brought to the heights of perfection. But it is nothing burdensome, and it is nothing harsh. Thank you, and God bless.